are simply too high for the survival of PD. Those few bats that survive a white nose outbreak groom off visible signs of the fungus before leaving the cave, although they continue to carry the dying fungus for some weeks or months. The fungus actually invades the skin, growing beneath the surface. Now, this image, this is a little bit of bat skin that has been rolled up into a ball and embedded in wax and then sectioned. And the skin itself is in blue. The fungus is in purple or magenta. You can see some of those conidia, those spores that I mentioned, those asexual spores I mentioned earlier. And you can see where the fungus has actually invaded the skin here, where it's broken the skin and started to grow actually into the tissue beneath. The result is a cascade of physiological changes that result in bats burning off their fat stores before spring, and either starving to death in the cave or leaving the cave before the cold months have ended, before insect food is available, and starving on the landscape. These bats, they starve, as I say, or they freeze to death. Frequently, they're picked off by predatory birds, since starving white-nose infected bats will often fly during the daylight. Tragically, you'll no longer see clusters of hibernating cave bats like these little browns in New Brunswick at overwintering sites or maternity roosts anymore. So how did the white nose pandemic unfold in New Brunswick? Prior to white nose, we're aware that there were about 7,000 bats overwintering at about 10 hibernation sites in New Brunswick. This number is certainly an underestimate. Perhaps it's a gross underestimate of the total number of bats that overwintered in New Brunswick in the past. And we've since discovered some other overwintering sites. Regardless, these 10 sites, which we've studied intensively, can serve as a proxy for the fate of the overwintering bat population in New Brunswick as a whole. White nose becomes visible in overwintering bats as early as November. By mid and late winter, it started to take its toll, with numerous dead bats in hibernacula, and with the predators starting to move in to feast on bat carcasses, or bats leaving hibernacula and turning up dead on the surrounding landscape. Here are some numbers for this very dramatic decline at New Brunswick's largest bat hibernaculum after the introduction of white nose. So it started off with 6,000 bats. In the space of 3 years, we've gone to zero. So it's a very, very dramatic decline. It happens very quickly. These dead and dying bats soon turn to moldy bats, and then eventually to nothing but skeletal remains mixed into the cave floor. And that's all that remains of this particular bat population. This pattern, though, is short-lived. Over 3 winters, bat populations in New Brunswick declined by 99% after the appearance of white nose. That's the bad news. The good news is that some New Brunswick cave bats survived their PD infections. We continued to survey sites up to the winter of 2015, at which time we discontinued surveys. Our intention was to wait until about 2020 and then resurvey for any signs of recovery. Unfortunately, our own pandemic prevented this, and it now looks like it'll be 2022 before we can assess winter bats in New Brunswick for any recovery. That said, signs of recovery in the US since 2006, where the disease has been present much longer than in New Brunswick, have been limited. Modeling suggests that some species, like the northern long-eared bat, are actually facing extinction. But recent research in the US has also shown some changes in physiology, behavior, and genetic makeup in bat populations 8 to 10 years after first infection with PD. This suggests that some level of adaptation to PD is taking place, at least in some North American bats. However, bats are not like mice, with short lives and numerous large litters produced annually. Most bats produce a single young annually over relatively long lifespans of decades. A little brown bat may live for 30 years or more. So it may still be quite a while before we know to what degree New Brunswick cave bats will recover from PD. So you might be wondering, is there anything I can do to help New Brunswick bats? And the answer is yes. If you're one of the fortunate few that have bats in your home and they're not actually causing a problem, leave them alone. If you feel you must exclude bats from your home, and there are sometimes good reasons for wanting to do that, find out where the bats are getting in, block up those entry or exit points, but do it early in the spring before bats arrive, or later in the fall after young have dispersed and maternity roosts have broken up for the season. Put up a bat house. Karen Vanderwolf is launching a Canada-wide citizen science project to study the microclimate in bat houses that should be helpful in determining the requirements to ensure successful occupancy. Contact me. I'll put you in touch with Karen if you want to participate. Finally, avoid visiting caves and mines that might serve as overwintering sites for bats, especially during the winter hibernation period from October to May. And if you do enter during the summer months, carefully decontaminate your gear after your visit, and ideally do not transport that gear out of the region. So that's the current story of New Brunswick bats. While the future of bats in New Brunswick and in North America generally does remain uncertain, efforts to reduce mortality at wind turbines, a few hardy New Brunswick white-nosed survivors, and one species that seems to be doing well here in New Brunswick should give us hope for New Brunswick bats. So I'll thank you very much. I'll be happy to try and answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Don. That was a fantastic presentation.
Well, a little rough at the beginning, but anyway.
Yeah, no, it turned out great. I loved all the photos. We actually have a couple of questions, so I'll just go ahead and read them out to you.
All right.
The first question is from Holly Fraser, and she said, where did the white nose virus come from?
Well, we don't know. It originated, it's not a virus, it's a fungus. It originated in Europe or in Asia. We don't know how it got here. The assumption is that it was transported by people. It first turned up in a cave that was receiving a lot of commercial traffic, that it was a show cave in New York. So the assumption is that somebody perhaps went into a cave probably in Europe, picked up something on their clothing or their footwear, and then visited this site in North America and introduced the fungus that way. So since then, the fungus has been spread, not so much by people actually, although that's certainly a concern, but by bats flying around and moving from one site to the other.
On that same topic of people going into caves, we have a question that asks, are the scientists in any danger being in the caves without mouth and nose covering? So I guess, is there any harm, can white nose syndrome harm us, I guess is a good way to put it.
No, there's no sign that white nose is an issue for us. Normally when we go into caves though, you probably, in some of those photographs, you might have noticed that we're wearing Tyvek suits. We wash all of our gear very carefully, disinfect everything afterwards. Initially, when we started our work, we were very careful about we didn't want to move things from one cave to the next, but of course, all the caves in this region are infected now. So the big issue is moving white nose to other regions. If you remember back to the map that I showed, there are a few sites now on the West Coast. Much to everybody's surprise, a couple of years ago, white nose jumped about 1,500 kilometers from the East Coast, from the central part of North America to the West Coast. It's not clear how it got there, but there are a number of theories, but certainly humans probably had something to do with that. It wasn't bats. Most of the movement of bats is north-south rather than east-west.
Some more questions about the white nose spread is, what happens to animals that eat the infected bats? Can white nose spread to other species of animals? That's from Kathy.
No, there's been some efforts to actually try experimentally to try to infect some other hibernating animals, ground squirrels, for example, and that hasn't been a problem. The issue for bats is that when they're hibernating, their immune system apparently is likewise hibernating. And so their body doesn't mount the same kind of defense that it might when they're above ground. And in fact, if they can get through the winter season, survive, and move out of the cave, in addition to the temperature being too high for white nose, they do mount an immune response to the fungus. But as far as we know, the fungus isn't a problem for any of these predators that consume the dead bats. If anything, it can become an issue in terms of the feces of these animals spreading the white nose fungus around.
Right. Tons of questions about the fungus, which is awesome.
Okay.
There's sort of two questions here, one from Holly and one from, where did I see this? Someone else I can't find, but it's about the spelunking community.
Yeah.
And Holly asks, does the spelunking community know about the need to avoid or decontaminate after participating in spelunking?
Yeah, it does. And there's been a lot of discussion about that. And I'm actually in touch with a number of people who were involved in spelunking. We're really trying to discourage people from going into these sites during the period when bats are hibernating. Even if there are very few bats there, we really want to give them a chance to get through the winter. If white nose is present and they're surviving, they need all the help they can get, because otherwise they're liable to burn off their fat reserves and just not get through the winter. So we're discouraging spelunkers from going into caves during that hibernation period from October until May. Now it's very hard, people are going to go into caves. I think regardless, some people, they're certainly going to go in the summer months. And under those circumstances, we're asking people to really decontaminate their gear and not to remove that gear take it to other regions or move it around.
There's sort of a follow-up from Zahira here, and she says that Australia is particularly strict about bringing in contaminants and takes measures to decontaminate shoes of passengers from flights arriving in Australia. Do you know if there's been any talk about doing something similar in Canada?
Well, in terms of white nose, it's too late.
Right.
White nose is here. The big concern now is that it will spread to BC. There's a very diverse bat population in BC, and it's actually not been possible to locate a lot of there aren't large hibernacula that are well known in BC, and so it's much more difficult to work with bats there than even here. So that's the big concern right now, is trying to prevent that movement of white nose westward at this stage. But it's here in North America. Hopefully bats will adapt to it. And it's present in Asia and in Europe. Bats are exposed to it. They've co-evolved with it, and they don't die in numbers from white nose the way they do here in North America.
Right. Still a couple questions about white nose, but I'm gonna just pivot a bit. We come back to the white nose questions in a second. But Melissa asks, are there any specific criteria to install a bat house at an urban home?
Well, one of the things with bat houses, and this is something that Karen is going to be looking at, is that the microclimate needs to be just right. And so siting your bat house is quite critical if you want to have bats in it. And that's actually something that Karen's going to be looking at in terms of microclimate. At this latitude, you probably want to put your bat house on a southern side of the house, because bats like it to be warm and dry for maternity roosts. You don't want the bat house to be down too low. But other than that, sometimes it's hard to predict. You'll put a bat house up and get nothing in it, and sometimes you put a house up and for reasons that aren't apparent, it's occupied.
Right. A question from Jolene about rabies. She says, I remember reading an interview with CBC a few years ago about the increase in big brown bats, but also seeing a correlating increase in rabies found in big brown bats. Is there any new data or an update on this?
Well, no, there is a somewhat higher incidence of rabies in big browns than in little browns. It's still very low. in terms of the percentage of bats that are, it's probably in the maybe 4 to 8% range, but at least among bats that have been looked at. But there's a bias there towards sick bats that are turned in. So it's probably lower than that, maybe in the 2% range. Right now, certainly when bats end up in people's homes, we're discouraging people from handling those bats. If there's any contact with the homeowner or with pets in the house, then the bat is typically euthanized and checked for rabies. If you find bats in your home during the winter months, if they end up in the living space, it's difficult sometimes to know what to do. You can put them outside. Big browns do move between hibernacula during milder weather, so they may find somewhere else to overwinter. But if you're concerned, you can contact public health and or the Fish and Wildlife Branch, and arrangements will be made to pick that bat up, and it will be it'll be euthanized and checked for rabies. Typically, the bats that are waking up during the winter months are juveniles that have not got enough fat to get through the winter anyway, and so their chances of survival are probably reduced.
Okay.
But rabies is it's not particularly prevalent in bats. No, we're talking say 4 to 8%. So there's not every bat is rabid, but certainly it's understandable that people would not want maternity colonies to be sizable ones in their homes.
Right. I felt like when I was a kid, I was always told to stay away from bats because they all had rabies. So it's good to know that that is not true.
Well, I mean, it's still good to stay away from bats because
Yeah.
some of them do carry rabies.
Mm-hmm. This is a great question from Damien. They say, do you suspect in a world without white nose that bats would still be declining due to declines of their invertebrate food sources, like the way that aerial insectivores are declining?
That's an interesting question for sure. Certainly for tree bats, wind turbines are the big issue. So regardless whether we have white nose or not, it's a different issue for tree bats. There are some bats that are dependent on older stands of forest. So as we cut down those forests, that's a problem for those bats. So there will be declines there. On the other hand, for a species like little brown, that's a species that actually may have increased since Europeans arrived here. We've provided some excellent maternity roosts in the form of our own homes, in attics, and particularly in older houses that weren't as well sealed as houses are now. So numbers of those kinds of bats, those species of bats, may have actually increased over the last century or so. Of course, they've now dramatically decreased, and some of those species are now endangered. But the decline in insects is certainly going to be a problem for bats.
Sort of a segue from that, you mentioned that wind turbines are the bigger threat to bats, and so a couple people have asked.
For tree bats, it is.
For tree bats. Yeah. And so a couple people have asked, are wind turbines being redesigned to be more safe for bats?
There are a number of things. It's mostly going on in the U.S. research to try to minimize mortality of bats at wind turbines. Part of it has to do with the way where wind turbines are sited, but there are also efforts underway to try to help bats detect wind turbines and to avoid them. There's also some evidence that bats may be attracted to those kinds of sites because of the number of insects that are there. So a lot of that research is still in the early days, but it certainly is an issue. There are monitoring programs at wind turbines as well to try to get a better sense of the numbers of bats being killed at specific sites, because not every wind turbine site has large numbers of bats killed at it.
Okay. Pivoting back to white nose syndrome, do you know if any of the bat populations are developing protection against white nose syndrome, and also are only cave-dwelling species affected by white nose? And if so, which species are these?
Yes, it is only cave-dwelling species. In New Brunswick, principal three are the little brown, the long-eared, and the tricolored bat. Big browns are susceptible to white nose as well, as are the tree bats, which very rarely enter caves, so they're not exposed to the disease. Because big browns don't enter caves at this latitude, their white nose isn't a huge issue for them. They tend to be less susceptible to white nose anyway, but in areas south of New Brunswick where they enter caves, white nose, they're susceptible to white nose for sure.
And I'll put together again 2 white nose questions here. One, can you just treat the bats with fungicide? And then 2, does the fungus persist in caves without bats? If so, for how long?
Well, I'll answer the second part of that question first. Yes, it does persist. We've been going into caves here in New Brunswick where there have been no bats for several years, and we're easily able to take a swab from the cave wall and develop a culture of white nose in a lab. So white nose isn't dependent on bats for survival. What was the first part of the question again? I've forgotten.
The first part is, can you just treat the infected bats with fungicide?
Yeah, that's been discussed. The problem is that there are all sorts of other fungi in caves and insects and other kinds of cave life that are likely to be susceptible to that fungicide. So you don't want to just start spraying fungicide into caves randomly. Caves are very delicate habitats. They support unique life forms. So that's actually not an approach. But I mean, certainly the white nose fungus is susceptible to fungicide. You can kill it with the fungicide, but unfortunately you kill a lot of other things as well.
Right. Ron is wondering if he can ask a question about a bat species that doesn't occur in New Brunswick.
Sure.
He's wondering if the Mexican free-tailed bat, the world's largest colony with an estimated 20 million bats in the Bracken Cave in Texas, has been impacted. I assume he means by
white nose.
Yeah. If not, please clarify, Ron.
I'm not that aware that has. I'm not sure. I don't think white nose has. It may be in Texas, but it's not. I don't think it's widespread. I know initially there was some feeling that the fungus wouldn't survive that far south. There was some modeling done that suggested that Georgia might be the southern extent of white nose, but it actually has gone a bit farther south than that extended. I haven't heard that it's an issue for the Mexican free-tailed bats at this stage.
Another question about a non-New Brunswick bat is, did the fungus devastate European bats?
It may well have, long before we were recording information, but we have no evidence of that. It appears that fungus and bat have co-evolved, have reached some kind of a system so that the bats are able to survive. The fungus will certainly grow on the bats, but it doesn't lead to the mortality that it does here in North America. So it's very similar to any animal or any naive population being exposed to a new disease, the same way we are with COVID. We don't have any natural immunity to this, and North American bats had never been exposed to this fungus. The same way that indigenous people in North America hadn't been exposed to a lot of European diseases, and it devastated their populations as well. So hopefully there will be a recovery, but at this stage we don't know.
Okay. I have 2 more questions. So if you think I have missed your question, because there was a ton in the chat, feel free to write it again. The first is, have you, and I'm sorry, I don't know the person's name because I only see their phone number, but have you recently seen female bats with healthy young?
There are some bat houses that we've seen that have had maternity colonies in them. We haven't seen the large numbers of bats in homes. I'm aware of a number of sites that where I could go and see, hundreds of bats, and there's nothing there now. There are no bats at all in those maternity roosts. So there are some bats surviving. There are some bats reproducing, but the numbers are very small. It's encouraging, but they're very small.
That's good. And then last question from Jolene, but we do have a bit of time still. So again, get your final questions into the chat. Jolene asks, when bats are found roosting in or around houses or close to humans, is there protection for them due to their endangered status?
Yes, there is. There are 3 species, of course, that are considered endangered. If you have bats and you want to remove them from your home, there are ways to go about that so that you don't hurt the bats. And certainly any pest control operator who's dealing with bats is aware of the situation and has to act accordingly. The legislation that protects endangered species is actually doesn't protect maybe habitat as well as one might like, but certainly bats have a lot more protection now than they did in the past, when they were generally just regarded as a pest. And maternity roosts, for example, would be sometimes sealed up at the wrong time of year, causing pretty high mortality.
We have 2 more questions, so they're continuing to come in. Tim asks, what is the ripple effect of the decline in certain bat populations? Are we seeing an undesirable rise in the populations of certain insects or other species?
Well, first of all, we're not monitoring insects the way we need to, but to be able to track that. But in fact, of course, insects are declining for all sorts of reasons. So no, we're not seeing any ripple effect in that respect. There's been some suggestion that maybe the increase in the number of big brown bats might be the result of the decline in little brown, but I don't think that's very likely, because the increase in big brown bat numbers started to occur long before white nose turned up here. There was an increase in big browns probably by the year 2000, so 20 years ago. So I don't think there's a relationship there.
I have a follow-up question to that. Do any bat species in New Brunswick eat each other?
No, all of our bats eat insects, strictly
Okay.
insect eating.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, you mentioned that. And then one last question. This might be a good one to end on. But this person asks a personal question. What attracted you to study bats in particular?
Well, I was interested in natural history in general, and I was interested in caves and went into caves and mines here and during the winter months, and got interested in bats. I'm not sure. I mean, I've worked on a number of different things besides bats, so I wouldn't say I was attracted to bats in particular. I was working on a number of different small mammal groups, bats among them. So I wouldn't say I'm focused exclusively on bats, but I've done a lot of work on bats in the last couple of years.
There's actually one more question. Has there been any studies done to find a way to disinfect caves?
Well, you can certainly disinfect caves with fungicide, and we talked a little bit about that earlier. But the problem is you end up there's a lot of sort of collateral damage. You end up killing fungi, killing insects and other species that are dependent on some of these things in the cave that you don't want to kill. So disinfecting the caves is probably not practical. One of the things that was tried was building artificial caves adjacent to known cave sites, and then of course these could be easily disinfected, and then trying to attract bats to these sites. That was tried early on and unfortunately wasn't successful. Bats are very particular about where they would like to be, and they didn't make use of those sites. So really, there's no easy way to remove white nose from these sites. It's really endemic in these caves now. It's part of the ecosystem, and we're not going to remove that fungus, I don't think.
Okay. I think that might be all the questions. There's tons of comments in the chat saying thank you. It looks like people learned a lot. Amazing webinar. Thank you very much. Donna, I encourage you to read the chat to read some of these very kind comments. But that is it for this evening. Thank you to everyone for coming and participating. Before I let you go, I want to let everyone know about the future webinars we have coming up in the series. On March 3rd, we have Scott Gilliland from the Canadian Wildlife Service talking about common eiders in the Bay of Fundy, and a bonus webinar on March 24th about the life and times of owls in New Brunswick, given by Nelson Poirier of Nature Moncton. So once again, thank you for joining us this evening. We hope that you enjoyed the webinar and that you learned a lot. I know I did. And we hope to see you in a couple of weeks for the next one. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dawn.
Okay, bye-bye.
See ya.